So we're on our sixth category of our Flaskr tutorial. This is the static files category. This is a very short category, so this might be a good time to do a quick review of the previous categories. In the first category, we were talking about the project layout. We started with a basic Hello Pi file just to get things started. We create an instance of the Flask class, and this is just one simple file. It has a single route and just returns hello world. Most applications are much more complicated than that, so instead we use what are called packages, which is basically a folder that contains all the different files that are going to be used in the application. And here's a layout of what our package will look like. Inside of a Flaskr folder, we'll have the dunderinit.py file. This is the file that creates the instance of the Flask class. We'll create a db.py file, a schema.sql, which has the SQL that creates two tables in our database. We'll have an auth.py file, which is the views for the authentication part of the site, and a blog.py file, which will contain the views for the blog parts of the site. There'll be templates, which is what we just talked about recently, and there's a template for each of the view files. So we have an auth folder for the auth views and a blog folder for the blog views, and in each of these folders are the HTML files that will be created for those categories. And then the static folder is what we'll be talking about in this lesson. We'll get to that in a minute. The application setup, creating our instance of the Flask class inside a factory function. This allows us to apply configuration, if-else condition tests, and try except tests, and then return the app. And then we defined our database. We're using SQLite. We're importing Click. So far we're only using one instance of Click, and that is after we define the functions to get the database and close the database. And here's the schema.sql that creates the two tables. We also create an initialized database function, and that will implement this schema.sql, which drops a user and blog table if they exist and recreates them from our schema file. In order to initiate that, we have to run this command. This is from the Click decorator that we are using. That helped us to create this CLI command, which initiates the database. So we also talked about blueprints and how it's much more organized to organize your views and other code in separate blueprints. And so we started with just the authentication code, and we created an authentication blueprint, and here it is down here. When we want to initialize a view for the authentication, we're referencing it from the blueprint. Here's the code for the auth.py. There's one for login. We had one up here for register. And then, of course, there's logout. And then we talked about templates, the render template function. We saw that in the auth.py views file. And so here's, after we created our login function, we do everything we need to do for the login, define the username, password, DB, error, and user properties of the login. And we get the username from the form, password from the form, and we execute the getDB function. We're selecting an item from the database. After we do all that, we're going to be rendering is the login HTML. We only created authentication template. We'll get to the blog template later. But here's the base HTML, and this is basically the structure for the whole website, and it has these block statements, which are variable placeholders that the other templates will populate. But every page on the site is going to have a title, every page is going to have this nav, and every page is going to have a header and content section, and the templates will populate these block placeholders. So they'll all have the same structure, but they'll have different content in them. So that takes us to our static files lesson. It says static files. The authentication views and templates work, but they look very plain right now. Some CSS can be added to add style to the HTML layout constructed. The style won't change, so it's a static file rather than a template. Flask automatically adds a static view that takes a path relative to the Flaskr/static directory and serves it. Base.html template already has a link to the style.css file. We saw that back here. There it is. There's our reference to the style CSS file. Besides CSS, other types of static files might be files with JavaScript functions or a logo image. They are all placed under the Flask/static directory and referenced with URL_for, in quotes, static comma, file name equals whatever. This tutorial isn't focused on how to write CSS, so you can just copy the following into the Flask/static/style.css file. You can find a less compact version of style CSS in the example code, and you can go to http://127.0.0.1:5000/auth/login, and the page should look like the screenshot below. You can read more about CSS from Mozilla's documentation. If you change a static file, refresh the browser page. If the change doesn't show up, try cleaning your browser's cache. And now we'll continue on to the blog blueprint.